which it is not, and also hinge upon, other sort of theorems such as dark matter and that sort of thing. The point is, over the last year, especially in my personal experience, so many so called proofs of a spinning sphere Earth have been completely debunked. And all of the traits of the world being exclusive to a spinning sphere are indeed possible on a stationary plane. So, in other words, these pillars of the spinning globe proof, like the Coriolis effect, or what goes up must come down, for example, all of these so-called globe Earth proofs are totally doable on a stationary plane, circumnavigation being another one. All of this stuff is totally doable on a stationary plane, and yet for some reason people have been programmed into believing that these observations are exclusive to a spinning sphere. I think what goes up must come down is the most laughable and preposterous of all. Now, there may be some perceived physical issues with some of the more widely known or widely quote unquote accepted flat Earth models, namely the central northern azimuthal equidistant projection sort of situation. However, I will mention that is not a model, it's a projection based on latitude and longitude lines, which have been sort of assumed since the 1500s, based on calculations in the north and assumptions in the south. Not to mention many going so far as to purport a dome in the sky as if it were a proven fact. So I think it's important to keep this conversation with our feet on the ground, both when discussing the heliocentric model as well as the flat Earth model, and let's at least attempt to keep, physical proofs or so-called proofs based on physical repeatable experiments, and leave the theorizing to the, philosophers. And there's no problem with philosophizing, but I think it's important to delineate between science and philosophy, which theoretical astrophysics is sort of a blending of the two. It's a blending of science and it's a blending of philosophy, which really does give scientists a bent or a bias in their conclusions and research. Now, I think it's important to consider all options, even including a dome in the sky. However, an astronomical plane is just as likely as a physical dome situation, and I think that there's good evidence to support that any dome-like tendency of our environment at its highest point above the ground probably involves something along the lines of an electromagnetic field or possibly a toroidal EM vortex, and with the magnetic vortex in the central north, lending credence to things like the North Pole star and even Tesla's likening of the world to a giant capacitor plate where the ionosphere is the other plate to make the connection. The point is, although the flat Earth proponents might not have a 100% working model, I think I might point out that the heliocentric model has been irreparably obliterated in terms of a working model, in many shapes and forms. Physical experiments, hypothetical experiments, and simple observations which contradict, falsify, and ultimately disprove the heliocentric hypothesis. The likes of NASA and the sci-fi mainstream media programming have done a very excellent job to convince the world at large that our little speck of a world is just some insignificant piece of dust orbiting an insignificant little sun, just one in a billion just in the galaxy, which the galaxy is just one in a billion in the universe, making our entire world and all of human history just about as insignificant as, a grain of sand on the beach. The religion of science or scientism as a paradigm has made sure to tout their philosophical belief system as factual and slant any esteemed scientific body towards arriving at conclusions to support their belief system and to support their model, whilst ignoring and even ridiculing evidence, experiments, and conclusions which falsify or contradict their model. This is not just some unsubstantiated claim, and even to this day, scientists find the idea of the Earth being central, special, or even significant somehow quote, frightening. And it's that sort of ideology which has permeated the upper echelons of scientism as a paradigm or science as a belief system for apparently many hundreds of years. And I should just remind the viewer that science is a process to discern the truth based on honest, repeatable experiments. To put it in its, most basic form. Now, I'm sorry to say that while we think of the Dark Ages as some ignorant time in the past, we are, for all intents and purposes, living in a more complex yet insidious form of ignorance, just like the Dark Ages, or maybe misunderstandings, just like the Dark Ages, because we're given the illusion of truth and enlightenment and understanding of the universe, so to speak, when most of, quote, science is indeed a cult of belief systems which are very much based in theory, conjecture, and basically exclusion of certain proofs or certain observations that fly in the face of their belief system and model. And at the same time, they, promote and lend credence to and provide scientific bravado for anything that happens to fall in line with their theory or philosophy or their model. Now, instead of just ensuring the population is ignorant by, for example, not teaching them to read in the Dark Ages, at least in Europe, in terms of the peasant classes. In modern times, we're given a different sort of ignorance and a much more clever and maybe subtle form, which is far more effective than the former. Call the Dark Ages Ignorance 1.0, while the current society at large is at Ignorance Core I7. The ignorance that is tattooed onto or into our psyche at as young an age as possible is parroted by all authority figures in the matters of science or theoretical physics, and I have been guilty of this for the majority of my life, as I'm 35 and I've been only really looking at this whole thing skeptically for the last year. So, isn't it sort of amazing that we're taught the heliocentric model at a very young age? Any arguments we may have had against the heliocentric model then were sort of squashed by the authorities, and as adults, we never really take the time to skeptically scrutinize the topic again, and it's very, very important that we do. The whole Big Bang, heliocentric, spinning spherical Earth hypothesis is indeed very bizarre, outlandish, and wholly unbelievable as a model of the universe. However, they've achieved domination of our minds at such an early age. Any person with a modern education will adhere to the preposterous long before looking at the truth as an alternative. To be very honest, it's amazing to me that this conversation and debate have made so much headway over the past year or two. However, it's really no surprise given the freedom of information sharing on the internet. In several recent scenarios, globe Earth skeptics throughout history have been ridiculed and discredited, and eventually their names forgotten, and their research and their legacy buried by the scientifical pontificates who'd like to maintain the status quo of ignorance. Maybe one example would be Tesla, and another example would be Dr. Samuel Rowbotham, or the author of Zetetic. Now, I'm not claiming that Tesla was necessarily a flat earther, because he did speak of things like planets, although there are, if you really do research a lot of the things that he wrote about and a lot of the things that he said, it really comes into question whether or not Tesla may have at least hypothesized the Earth as a stationary plane. Again, that's just because of certain references that he's made. I would urge everyone to sort of research the many, many writings of Tesla. But thanks to the recent outpouring of knowledge, and by recent I mean within the last decade or two, towards entering the age of Aquarius, eerily enough, we find that all things are slowly being revealed. And the beast system, which has been amassing its armies and rallying its troops across the world for really several decades, is poised to strike the final blow on peaceful civilization as we know it. Now, the good thing is we, the honest, hardworking, average, normal people outnumber these sort of militant, global, lack of a better word, globalist groups, 100,000 to one. Um, there is this sort of pre-programming where the majority of people, honest, hardworking people, are oblivious to the overall plan, which involve things like Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. But I strongly believe that if we can get this topic, the topic involving the very shape and nature of our world, seriously discussed in the mainstream, then there may be such a mass awakening of all sorts of people. We can have at least the start of the paradigm shift desperately needed to avoid another term of Obama 3.0, as in Hillary, or Bush 0.0, as in Trump, because both of these so called candidates are exactly the same choice, and they're exactly the ones benefiting from the schemes which siphon wealth from the common people and fatten the pockets of the rich. When people realize that the spherical Earth is a lie and NASA's a lie, the Republican slash Democrat dichotomy is a lie, and the Federal Reserve as a federal institution is also a lie, any political candidate who doesn't run against the rotten and festering financial political system, which has ensured the Republic of America has become a nation in physical and moral and financial decline, and none of this is by accident, but by exact design. The very people who control the stock markets, boom and bust the value of homes using slick deals and default swaps, run our political system much as they've done since 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was created, and they are inherently responsible for things like the Great Depression, and they gained basically all of the country's wealth in that, and most recently, the 2008 bust of the housing market here in America, which essentially really didn't benefit anyone except for the banks that had uh, default swaps on those companies and those investments. So it's time for these crooks, all of them, to go. But we can never achieve such a mass unification against this beast system until we come together on common ground that can make a really profound impact, which is beyond the scope of anything we can really imagine. As crazy as this seems, the awakening has begun, and I see more and more people just sort of accepting the Earth as a plane as a self-evident fact. I spent a lot of time, trying to convince people that there's something to this, and now it's almost as if the tide is turning a little bit, where I'm seeing it appears as if people are sort of accepting this as a self-evident fact, because it really is sort of plain and obvious once you really do go through this process of scrutinizing the heliocentric model and comparing that with the flat earth model. Now, this is very encouraging because we might be crossing a threshold of stages, which means this truth movement is poised to make major headway. Now, I implore all of the flat earthers out there to stand unified in our efforts and at least stand unified on the fundamentals. Now, for example, I'm sure we can all agree that the world isn't a spinning sphere, and beyond that, the burden of proof is truly on the conventional accepted model and the proponents of the heliocentric model to rebut. I want to really quickly thank all of my subscribers and all of the other dedicated truthers out there. If you honestly haven't looked into the flat earth, I implore you all to do so. Utilizing the scientific method to test a hypothesis will never harm you and can only lead you closer to the truth by the process of elimination or possibly aligning with one model over the other. This topic is not a waste of time, and if you want a chance to actually beat the so-called globalists, this one card, this one key card, really is the last Jenga piece or the key Jenga piece to crumbling the rest of this sort of beast system, which is very much a facade and which is very much theoretical physics and ultimately the Big Bang Theory, evolution, the spinning sphere Earth, etc. These sorts of theories really all come crumbling down with some basic fundamental observation and a breaking of the programming that we've all been subjected to since we were toddlers and even before. So I find it unnecessary and irrelevant to produce a working flat Earth, which it is not, and also hinge upon, other sort of theorems such as dark matter and that sort of thing. The point is, over the last year, especially in my personal experience, so many so called proofs of a spinning sphere Earth have been completely debunked. And all of the traits of the world being exclusive to a spinning sphere are indeed possible on a stationary plane. So, in other words, these pillars of the spinning globe proof, like the Coriolis effect, or what goes up must come down, for example, all of these so-called globe Earth proofs are totally doable on a stationary plane, circumnavigation being another one. All of this stuff is totally doable on a stationary plane, and yet for some reason people have been programmed into believing that these observations are exclusive to a spinning proofs based on physical repeatable experiments and leave the theorizing to the, philosophers. And there's no problem with philosophizing, but I think it's important to delineate between science and philosophy, which theoretical astrophysics is sort of a blending of the two. It's a blending of science and it's a blending of philosophy, which really does give scientists a bending sphere. I think what goes up must come down is the most laughable and preposterous of all. Now, there may be some perceived physical issues with some of the more widely known or widely quote unquote accepted flat Earth models, namely the central northern azimuthal equidistant projection sort of situation. However, I will mention that is not a model, it's a projection based on latitude and longitude lines, which have been sort of assumed since the 1500s, based on calculations in the north and assumptions in the south. Not to mention many going so far as to purport a dome in the sky as if it were a proven fact. So I think it's important to keep this conversation with our feet on the ground, both when discussing the heliocentric model as well as the flat Earth model, and let's at least attempt to keep, physical proofs or so-called